in terms of, Sydney can't come out with a message saying, Europeans are welcome here in London, but London voted to remain. So what do you think we'll see in terms of movement of Europeans from the rest of England?
Okay, 3 more questions. I mean, economically, the areas that voted leave are many of which have seen huge losses in kind of traditional industries, are coal, steel, manufacturing industry, and as the man from the Commission said, are a replacement by insecure jobs. Maybe Ryan, you'd like to kind of reflect on that kind of economic contradiction and how the Leave campaign is going to kind of square that essentially kind of in Labour areas.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting in the analysis, which I think I read in the Sunday Times, which, what stood out for the people who voted Leave was disproportionately from areas strong in manufacturing or traditionally strong in manufacturing, and people with low educational attainment disproportionately went to Leave. There's a very good article by John Harris, which is, the arguments put out by Remain were about risk to the economy, to livelihoods. A lot of people voted Leave don't have that much, so actually there wasn't that much to lose, and I think we need to take that into account. On the younger generation thing, I mean, what's interesting is, on my Facebook wall, there's huge numbers of people sort of howling at the fact that that they've lost their country. This is terrible. But the fact is that people who are older voted much more. I mean, it was talking like nearly 100%. It's sort of 90%-ish, I think. Whereas young people just didn't vote as much, and they have to take that responsibility. They have to vote. And yes, politicians have to reach out more to them, but also young people have to see it as a civic duty to vote as well. It's got to be a two-way thing. And it's ironic because a lot of people are now taking the argument which David Cameron was wrong to call the referendum, was wrong to do this. People don't understand these tough choices. Are now the ones calling for a second referendum. I mean, it's just, it is bizarre. On this point about free movement, I think you've captured exactly the right differentiation in the Conservative Party between the economic liberals and the social conservatives. We did a report which really brought out that typology, and that there is differences. And I think, as I said in my opening remarks, the leadership contenders, there will be, are we going to go for a single market, free trade, etc., or are we going to prioritise restricting migration? I think the leadership contest will be fought over that. But I think that also exists within the Labour Party, because you have the kind of cosmopolitan liberal left, and then you have the people who want to emphasise protecting people from working class communities who felt the changes of globalisation and mass immigration each more. So the fault lines are there. There's a great piece by Jeremy Cliff, which he did a couple of years ago, about communitarians versus cosmopolitans, and he said it exists both within the Tory party and the Labour Party. But my own view on free movement is that if the EU had given more to the UK on free movement, I think Remain would have stood a much greater chance of winning. I mean, the free movement principle, I think, is now antiquated for a bloc which has changed remarkably. And for those of us who are pro-migration, we also know that people want control over migration, so it's properly managed. And therefore, on that basis, free movement is contradictory to that. And I think in the future, you will see other countries pushing for a change to that principle. And that's why I wanted to stay in, because I think in the long run there will be changes to that free movement principle. There's a kind of slavish adherence to it within the EU at the moment, but it is undermining the project. The EU institution, I think, the main reason why people are so against it is that free movement principle, and I think it will change in the future and should change.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Mark's point is a huge challenge, and I think that is going to be very difficult for both parties to square. I mean, that's the the work we were doing before the referendum. We sort of set out a liberal plan for Brexit, and I think the fact is, as I said, I mean, there is going to be some cost to leaving. So how do you offset that? And my argument, sort of before the referendum and now, would be that the UK is going to have to become more globalised, to sort of succeed economically. And I think that does raise that challenge that you said. How do you do that when you, I think overwhelmingly the Leave vote did come from people you say you feel insecure about globalisation, and that sort of raises much bigger questions about the UK labour market, kind of sort of vocational type jobs and those kind of is that what the UK's strengths are, or are we going to have to? I mean, I think the fact is the UK is going to have to be much more nimble and much more prepared to accept the world as it is. I mean, that's one of the consequences of leaving. So I think that is a very difficult one. And on the free movement thing, I think, yeah, if you look at it just as free movement and the single market, yes, that is obviously the choice, and it's very difficult. As I said, I think that's why the UK has to think much longer and harder about. I mean, we are the 5th biggest economy in the world. We are. If ignore the whole referendum, if we were outside the EU would want to do a deal with us. So what is it that we can offer? Because as I think everyone has said, it seems that free movement has to be, curtailing free movement in some way has to be part of the bargain from the UK side. I think it's very difficult to see how it's not. But how that looks in practice and how it feels in practice, again, I'm not convinced it will feel that different. I think the numbers might come down a bit. But how you kind of give control to that in terms of, I mean, obviously in the EEA you have this emergency brake, which is one of the things that Cameron was talking about negotiating whilst in. So there is something extra in the EEA agreement that isn't in full EU membership. Whether that would be enough, I'm not sure, but it might be. And also we have to remember that the Swiss, for example, had a referendum on this very issue, so they're going to be trying to negotiate something similar to what we were trying to negotiate. So this is a debate that's going on anyway, and we're going to add greater weight to those outside who might want to see something different. But I think if it's just seen as a straight choice between immigration and free movement, then I think, and the single market, then I think it is very difficult to see it, how you surpass that. But I think if you throw in the bigger geopolitical elements of this and what the UK actually can, if it is sensitive about it, what it can bring to the table, then I think intellectually you can see a way around that, but I think it's going to be very difficult.
Okay, we've got time for 2 very quick questions, Seamus and Rob, and then the speakers will round up very, very quickly. Seamus.
It's not going to be quick, but just taking the points about the responsiveness of the political system in Westminster and the points earlier raised about how the referendum hasn't necessarily unleashed, but has highlighted pre-existing tensions that were already there. And applying that to Northern Ireland, I noted today that Boris Johnson's piece in the Telegraph made no mention of Northern Ireland. Given that there are no votes to be won by any of the major parties in Westminster about Northern Ireland, what is it going to take to get the Westminster establishment to start paying attention to the North, given that there are very considerable concerns about how the referendum will impact the peace process and the role that the EU has played in the peace process in Northern Ireland?
Rob.
I think it's a quick question, complicated one. It's unnerving for me, has been for a long time, and probably other sensible people, I think, the way in which Scotland is described, the extreme views and variation that happens. Last week Scotland was the potential saviour of the room. Now it's the whole country's been presented as a villain or blocking or disloyal, or a utopian paradise that liberal elites escape to get away from this hellish experience. Of course the reality is nothing like that. The reality is a much more mundane, prosaic picture, and Sundar's right. I don't think he's right to say 1 million Leavers are SNP. He may not be far off. There were 1 million, in a small country, 1 million people voted to leave. Sturgeon, who's been presented as the steady hand in all of this madness, which is a genius in her narrative that she's built up. Of course, has got this puffed up party, and a lot of those, in terms of membership, a lot of these members will have absolutely no interest in. They want to be separate from the UK. They probably want to be separate from the EU as well. So this is a real challenge, I think, that she's going to have to grapple with. That discipline that the SNP had, that confidence in values about being separate within you is sort of really going to be challenged. And I think she probably knows that very well and is worried about that. The question is, this track around another referendum and so on, what does that do to this bigger project, which is about breaking down the us and them, the elites and the others? Is it a sideshow distraction? Is it an unhelpful thing? Or does it help with that broader project?
I think I'll give Sundar the stance on Northern
There's-
Ireland and Scotland.
Because
Scotland.
loads, yeah, Northern Ireland, Scotland. I mean, Northern Ireland, I mean, and you're right, it hasn't been paid attention to. I saw Ian Paisley Jr. was tweeting offering to sign people's applications for Irish passports. So it's sort of some surprising turns in the politics, and
Yeah.
certainly all the debates about the market and immigration and so on, you know, just are very difficult to work out for Northern Ireland. Although I do think one reason that the Unionist vote, the Protestant vote, leave was that people actually were quite annoyed with saying you have to vote in or the peace process has gone, which is another of these sorts of over-dramatised sort of stories about the consequences, as with Scotland. I think Nicola Sturgeon has played the thing very, very well, and like Sadiq Khan, she's been rather strong in what it means culturally and so on. I was on the Asian Network on Friday, and Humza Yousaf, the SNP minister, was one of the phones, and he said she'd been speaking to Sadiq Khan about forming a common front on these issues about what they can do. So you can see, you know, that might go down well or badly, but it's the media. But it's a real point, actually, that in this choice, I think there's also a bargaining position. It's very difficult to become independent right now in Scotland, because you've got to either float an independent currency, tricky, or join the euro, you know, maybe wait for that to bed in a bit more before you want to. And so I think there is a reasonable point where she can go and fly to Berlin and to Brussels and see what's on offer that way, and then come back to London and say, what have you got, really? Because, you know, what options are there? And so it makes that trade-off, again, very very difficult. But, you know, if there's a majority in Scotland to have an independent country now, because that's another massive thing on which you disagree with the union you're part of. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate if that's what people want to do, I think. And we already have a separate politics, a separate media. You know, we didn't have a general election in Britain. We had a Scottish election, an English election, and a Welsh election. It's Wales that gets ignored in these debates. It wasn't that surprising that Wales, you know, feels incredibly left